The Census Bureau counts people in the United States. The Agriculture Department counts farms. In fact, the National Agricultural Statistics Service recently issued its latest count of farms and ranches in the United States. Here with the details, the Chief of the Service's Environmental, Economics, and Demographics Branch, Bryan Combs. Mr. Combs, good to have you with us.
Hi, good morning, Tom. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here and answer some questions about the Census of Agriculture.
Yeah, tell us your methodology for gathering this information, because it's a constantly changing landscape with mergers and acquisitions. And how do you count farms and ranches?
So once every 5 years, National Agricultural Statistics Service goes out to approximately 3 million farms, and we do that by sending out Census of Agriculture forms to those producers and ask them to return that. We start that data collection process in November of the census year, and we collect data through the first part of the next year before we start summarizing and putting out all the details.
So it's a paper type of mail process?
That is correct. We typically will send out survey forms. We do have online reporting that is available to producers. The large majority of forms are returned via mail. However, we have been seeing an increase in those online responses.
And how do you count multi-location conglomerates? Because most farms nowadays is corporate. And so you have a Tyson's or this company or that company that might have, 25 chicken farming locations or whatever. Is that one farm? Is it 25 farms? How does that work?
So we actually count based on the producer that's operating that. So if they have multiple locations, we do consider that as one farm. And then we try to break that production out based on the state, county that those multiple operations are in. One thing I would note is that the large majority of farms are actually family farms and not actually corporate farms.
I guess maybe economically it's mostly corporate, or not that case either.
It's really not that case at all. Approximately 95% of farms are family farms. Now, some of those farms could still be very large. However, they're not really owned by corporations. They're more family-oriented farms.
Right. And what counts as a farm? I mean, a ranch, you can tell, they grow livestock or they grow crops. What about beekeepers and that kind of thing?
Yes, so we define a farm as any place which produced or would have produced $1,000 worth of agricultural products on that operation.
So that could be even an urban farm could produce that much.
Yes, the definition to qualify is not a very high threshold. So that could be many different makeups of agricultural production that could qualify you as a farm.
I guess you could sell 5 orchids for $200 each and you would get into the census.
Yes, that is correct. So we typically tell producers when you get that form to complete it and let us evaluate it and determine if you are a farm, because we do want to make sure we count all activity that's going on across the U.S.
All right. So between the 18 count and the 2022 count, or 17 and 22, what emerged? What are the big trends people should understand about agriculture in the United States?
One of the things we did see a decline in the number of farms and the land in farms. So the number of farms were 1.9 million, and that covered about 880.1 million acres. There were 3.4 million producers that were counted in the 2022 Census of Agriculture. Some of the other major changes there, they produced $543.1 billion in agricultural products, and that was up from $388.5 billion in 2017.
All right, so there's fewer farms but greater value that they're producing. Of course, that depends on commodity prices at a given moment.
That is correct. So there were fewer farms, but there was a pretty substantial difference in the value of commodities from 2017 to 2022. As you mentioned, that was largely driven by some pretty high commodity prices for both crops and livestock over that period. And
do you also get at productivity of farms? Because the thing that's enabled the United States to be such a giant food producer relative to the 1800s when there was 10 times as much farmland, it's all about productivity and scientific innovation.
Yes, and that's one of the very interesting things in the census data series. You can actually see that change in productivity over time. So dating back to the 1800s when the first censuses were conducted, you can track that. Largely speaking, every 5 years there were some gaps in those census data series, but you can track and see how that productivity has changed and structurally how agriculture has changed over those various census cycles.
We're speaking with Bryan Combs. He's chief of the Environmental, Economics, and Demographics branch of the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And how does the USDA use this information? I mean, it's a nice picture, and we know how many farms they are and where they are. What do you do with that information?
Yes, that's another great thing about the census is it collects data down to the county level for all counties and parishes, boroughs across the U.S. That data is used in many ways. If we look at right now, Congress is looking at farm bill legislation. They're going to be looking closely at this as a resource to help make decision making on how the new policies for USDA for the farm bill are going to shape up. State and county governments can use this to do the same thing to look at programs to help support the agricultural activity or possibly even industries that are in their area.
And given that level that you mentioned, $1,000 of production worth in a given year, that means that you tell me there are actual farms still in New York City. There's probably a farm in Manhattan at $1,000.
Yes, and that's one of the trends we're starting to see is with some of you mentioned urban agriculture, that those are a growing population, that if they do meet that definition, we do qualify them as a farm and would report on them. As you mentioned, as we get into those more urban areas, the farms are pretty sparse for the most part, so may not always have data publishable on those, but we do make all efforts to collect that if it's there.
Yeah, a tree grows in Brooklyn, but maybe not so much corn. But a moment ago I mentioned orchids, but that really wouldn't count. It has to be food, right, to be a farm. Otherwise, it's horticulture.
No, we collect horticulture if those are agricultural products that are being produced. So fruits, vegetables, horticulture, sod. There's a ton of different potential ag commodities that could qualify you as a farm. So yeah, it doesn't have to be just that traditional, corn and cattle type things that others may think.
So that would include also like wood products, like lumber and hardwoods and so on.
Or that doesn't qualify you as a farm. If you have farm production, which would be one of the agricultural related commodities, but also have some timber production or something of that nature, that's considered as farm related income. But you must first qualify as a farm before we would actually pick up and report on that value.
So timber then generally not part of it.
Correct, is not part of the agricultural census.
But it could be floral and so on.
Yes, that is correct.
And the department itself must use this to allocate resources there's a myriad of farm support programs and so on, loan programs, to plan where all of that should be going. Fair to say?
Yes, that is true that the department is a big user of the Census of Agriculture data. It allows them the ability to look at their programs and what impact they potentially had over a period of time, and then to plan for new programs as they're looking at how they can best support, the farmers and ranchers across the country through the department's programs.
And I imagine the report is pretty highly read in the relevant precincts of Congress, committees and so forth that have to do with agriculture and the Agriculture Department.
Yes, it is. They are big users. We actually have a congressional district summarization that we actually provide to the Congress so they can see what agricultural activity is within their specific congressional district.
All right. And tell us about yourself a little bit. Do you come at this from a farming type of background in the family, or are you strictly an academic here that counts things?
Yes, so both of my parents grew up on working farms. They were some of those farms that were lost back in the late 70s, early 80s. And I've always just had a passion for it. I grew up in a rural area of southwestern Virginia, studied agricultural economics, and then became a statistician. So I've worked for the agency for approximately about 17 years. Spent a amount of time in upstate New York, working on livestock and dairy estimates, and then came into D.C. to work here at NASS for several years. My more recent to this current position, I was chief of staff for about 7 years for the agency, and really enjoyed getting back into to the actual work that we do in publishing the Census of Agriculture and many of the other environmental and economic reports that we put out.
And do you ever get out to a farm or two throughout the year just to kind of smell it and taste it and see what it's like in reality?
Yeah, so actually, when I get back home to visit my folks, I often get to visit friends and family that are still farming in the area and kind of stay connected to those agricultural producers.
Bryan Combs is chief of the Environmental, Economics, and Demographics branch of the National Agricultural Statistics Service, part of the USDA. Thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
We'll post this interview along with a link to the Farm and Ranch Census itself at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.